Hello, and welcome to the Communication Studies Fall Colloquium series. My name is Matt Dewey. I'm a clinical assistant professor of interdisciplinary media in the Communication Studies program at LMU. We're honored that you joined us, and we're really honored to have such a distinguished panel with us tonight on the eve of the 2020 presidential election to discuss what I think is a very important and timely element of our political culture. Our discussion tonight centers around the idea of style as a category of inquiry, the role of affect in determining our political affiliation and value systems, and the ways in which news media rely on style to punctuate their messages. Our panel tonight is interdisciplinary, made up of scholars from the fields of communication and political science, whose combined work looks at different facets of mediatization of the news and political culture, both historically and in our contemporary moment. I'd first like to introduce our guest speaker tonight, Dr. Reece Peck. Dr. Peck is an associate professor in the Department of Media Culture at Staten Island-CUNY. He's the author of Fox Populism, Branding Conservatism as Working Class, published it by Cambridge in 2019. His research engages the media dimension of the American political right, and specifically examines how conservative news media outlets have used tabloid media styles and populist political rhetoric to reconfigure the meaning of social class in the United States. He also provides commentary on television and politics for news outlets such as the Washington Post, Columbia Journalism Review, and New York Magazine. Our next panelist tonight is Ashley Campy. Dr. Campy is a visiting assistant professor in political science and international relations at LMU. Dr. Campy's research and teaching focuses on right and left social movements of the 20th and 21st century United States, the role of media and schools in democratic education, and race, sex, and gender in American political culture. Her work has appeared in journals such as Polity and Politics, Groups and Identities, and forthcoming in Theory and Event. Next is Dr. Christopher Finlay. He is Associate Professor of Communication Studies at LMU. He holds a PhD in Communication from Annenberg, the University of Pennsylvania, as well as graduate degrees in Political Science and Communication. Dr. Finlay specializes in digital media culture, global media industries, and political communication, and is authored over a dozen scholarly articles, as well as contributes expert commentary and original think pieces to popular cultural media outlets. Our next panelist is Dr. Richard Fox. Dr. Fox is a professor of political science at LMU and teaches in the areas of US Congress, election, and media and politics. He's authored and edited several books, including Running from Office, Why Young Americans Are Turned Off to Politics, iPolitics, Citizens, Elections, and Governing in the New Media Era, and Tabloid Justice, the Criminal Justice System in the Age of Media Frenzy. Our last panelist is Dr. Jason Jarvis. Dr. Jarvis is an assistant professor of communication at LMU. His work is concerned with the rhetorical power of visual media and its ability to influence our perception of the world and alter human behavior. Dr. Jarvis's published work is concerned with memory and political imagination in the construction of national and transnational public spheres, and his current book project investigates the ways in which social media is used to greenwash the oil industry in Southern California. We're honored to have you all with us tonight. Thank you very much. Tonight, we'll begin with a short presentation with Dr. Peck, as a way to sort of set the tone for the discussion. After Dr. Peck's remarks, each panelist will be asked to sort of share their comments and perspectives, and perhaps point a way that their own work sort of informs or can broaden this idea of style as a category of political inquiry. The discussion will then open to in a more organic way where panelists will sort of be free to comment and reflect. I will also be monitoring the Q&A feature and try to interject questions and comments as they come up. Just a quick note about the Q&A. Many times with the timing of how much time we have here, we can't address all of the questions, but Dr. Peck has agreed to answer any unanswered questions in a video response that we'll be posting to the COM website sometime after the presentation, so keep your eye out for that. Well, I think I've said enough, and now I would like to turn it over to Dr. Reece Peck.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Dr. Dewey and Chair Rich and the Communication Studies Department and the students, other folks that are tuning in tonight. It's a real honor to present my work. So I'll get into it, and let me share my screen. Start with Hannity's face. Okay, so the central question that my book explores is this tension between Fox News's aggressive advocacy of neoliberal economic policies and its distinctly working class mode of address. That is, its claim to speak for, quote, real Americans. But before I get into my book's main claims about how Fox negotiates this tension, allow me to say a little bit about the project's origins. So, like many academic books, this book started out as a dissertation. And in the middle of my doctoral program, a disastrous event occurred, this being the 2008 financial collapse and the subsequent recession. The social and political conditions of the Great Recession presented such an intriguing case study. And I wanted to know how conservative media was going to respond to such a clear crisis of legitimacy for its free market economic dogma, privatization, deregulation, tax cuts for the wealthy, trickle down. So I thought, why not have a look at how the most dominant conservative outlet is going to cover it, that being Fox News. And I was amazed at Fox's ability to advance conservative political narratives during the economic crisis, a moment when the issue of wealth inequality stood at the fore of America's collective consciousness. And so this convinced me that there was something more nuanced, something more complicated going on with the network's communication strategy, something worth investigating. Unlike the Iraq invasion of early 2000s, American conservatives did not have a natural advantage in the contest to determine how the public would interpret the Great Recession economic crisis. The topic of income inequality was the central political issue of the moment, a topic liberals and Democrats had owned since the 1930s. And yet, Fox News was still effective at shifting public anger away from corporate America and toward government. So I wanted to know how and why it was able to pull this off. So in early 2009, I committed myself to watching Fox News closely and systematically. I analyzed over 800 broadcast transcripts and used UCLA's television news archive to watch hours of Fox programming. And in the course of my research, I discovered elements of Fox's programming style that, yes, promote Republican policy goals, but that cannot and should not be reduced to them. So my book, Fox Populism, seeks to reveal what one could call the meta-political or extra-partisan qualities of Fox's appeal. Specifically, it zeroes in on the populist moral rationales and tabloid presentational techniques that Fox News has used to represent the Republican Party as the natural political home of the white working class. Now, these populist narratives and tabloid media styles have been recycled in American culture for centuries, and it is their historical rootedness, not their inherent conservatism, that gives them their power and resonance. So this is one of my main arguments. For over 2 centuries, the populist rhetorical tradition has provided American politicians with a vernacular language for describing class tensions. However, populist class critiques have historically been more moralistic than economistic, and this partly explains the discourse's great malleability. That is why populist terms like the people or the workers or the producers can be assigned to highly divergent socioeconomic groups and can serve highly divergent political agendas, from the leftist New Deal coalition of the 1930s to the Tea Party of the late 2000s, or to offer a more recent contrast from Bernie Sanders and the AOC-led Justice Democrats movement to Trump and the MAGA movement. So forged by activists and social movements, political populism's recurring moral themes center around civic issues such as democracy, institutional corruption, and the expression of popular will. Now, it is critical to note how the populist image of the producer or worker has almost exclusively been a white masculine image, even in cases when leftist movements deployed the tradition. So in addition to attacking aristocrats and power elites above, populist political formations have also involved scapegoating racial minorities and working women. So the second half of my book examines how Fox covered the passing of Obama's 2009 Stimulus Act and demonstrates how the network's framing of that policy event exploited the racial dimensions of populism, specifically by playing on pre-existing racial stereotypes about welfare dependency and state-based parasitism. So this raises an interesting question about whether or not populism and nationalism are in fact the same thing. You know, it's maybe a question we can explore in the Q&A. So the early chapters of my book engages this historical question of why did Fox News's partisan style of journalism take hold and flourish? So ever since Richard Nixon's fateful defeat to John F. Kennedy in the 1960 presidential election, conservatives have been dreaming of establishing a countervailing media system that could challenge the stranglehold that they believed liberals held over the journalism field. Yet every previous attempt to launch a conservative television network had failed miserably. So why did Fox News succeed? So my book outlines a set of societal trends that converged in the 1990s to lay the conditions for Fox's emergence. These include 1, technological advancements in communication like cable and satellite, and the subsequent rise of niche television markets. 2, the revival of partisan identification in America and the trend toward political polarization on the ground. So this uptick of polarization. And 3, the trend toward entertainment-driven formats in the news field, a process journalism scholars have called tabloidization, so foreshadows the Trump, right? So interestingly, there was a host of conservative TV projects that were launched, in the early 1990s, right before Fox News emerged. Newt Gingrich and Paul Weyrich's National Empowerment Television being the most successful of the failures. So these conservative networks celebrated the technological innovations in media, and they celebrated the conservative political insurgents of the 1990s with the Gingrich Revolution. But like many of their liberal counterparts, they decried that last trend, the growth of infotainment and sensational news. The failed conservative networks of the 1990s emulated the aspirational style of the first generation of conservative media producers like William F. Buckley, whose PBS show Firing Line, up until Fox, was the most successful example of conservative television. Fox News, on the other hand, gladly rode the tabloid wave of the 1990s and adopted many of the tabloid presentational features that helped establish the early television ventures of Rupert Murdoch's News Corporation being Fox's parent company. So in contrast to the aspirational style of Fox's conservative predecessors, Fox News innovated what I call a cultural populist style of journalism. So now the conventional take on Fox News's appeal is that it's all about the network's conservative ideological slant, a slant that critics argue is designed to confirm and validate the political views of Fox News's audience. Of course, I do not deny that Fox News's programming supports a conservative political agenda. However, I feel that the predominant focus on the network's ideological bias has blinded analysts from seeing other important ways in which Fox News speaks to and represents its audience and also garners cultural authority. Rupert Murdoch and Fox's founding CEO, Roger Ailes, mutually realized that creating a market for conservative television would entail much more than simply giving conservative audiences Republican talking points. Effective political branding, they understood, must capture how partisan identities are expressed as social communities with distinct class and ethnic valences. So having backgrounds in tabloid newspapers and daytime talk shows, Murdoch and Ailes had the requisite knowledge to design a journalistic style that reflected how conservatives imagine themselves as embattled, authentic, working class underdogs, and likewise how they view liberals as cultural snobs. So the key to understanding Fox News' effectiveness, both as a corporate brand and as a tool of political communication, lies not in the network's promotion of political conservatism itself, but rather in the elaborate way that Fox News treats political conservatism as a proxy for a particular social group and its taste culture. So another way to say this is that Fox News' programming constantly plays on this triangulated relationship where it constantly associates first a set of aesthetic and cultural references like country music and gun ownership with an imagined social identity, the white working class, and then finally with the political ideology, conservatism. Now, a growing body of political science research shows that social identity has a greater influence on political affiliation than ideology. It is far easier to adopt political views that match your family, your neighborhood, your ethnicity, than it is to select friends and spouses on the basis of your political preferences. So in other words, people tend to pick their friends first and their politics second, and not the other way around. So people do not directly identify with political parties and their platforms. Rather, their primary identification is with fellow party members, that is, the social groups and communities tied to the partisan label. Now, historians have observed a similar thing in relationship to the partisan papers that predominated 19th century America. Their popularity was not based on the information they imparted or the political ideology they promoted. Rather, the key is what historian Michael McGurk calls their political style, which is to say how these papers rhetorically engaged their readers by representing the political world in a familiar, identifiable way. Now, at the turn of the 21st century, we've seen the dramatic return of partisan news styles. But in this electronic age of partisanship, TV screens have taken the place of the political flags. When you see Fox News on at a gym, in a bar, or in someone's living room, you're prompted to think more about the people who selected the channel than about the news content itself. The network's journalistic voice immediately conjures a distinct social group in your mind, and its confrontational tone compels you, the viewer, to decide whether you are a supportive member of this group or a hostile outsider. So what often goes unquestioned in this idea is that political ideology is the main thing that defines the Fox News tribe. So how about I offer some examples to illustrate how cable news represents and indeed constructs the identity of America's opposing partisan camps. So the first clip is a promo of the O'Reilly Factor from 2009. While no longer on air, it was kicked off air in 2017 for various multiple sexual harassment charges. O'Reilly, more than any other Fox News show, the O'Reilly Factor, put Fox News on the map and kept the network in the driver's seat for more than 2 decades. So in short, the O'Reilly Factor is the quintessential Fox show. So I'll play a clip here of this promo.
Right. Number 1 in cable news, 100 months and counting.
You're either a moron or a liar. What kind of a sentence is that?
No spin, no agenda, just the truth.
The American people have a right to be angry. Look, stop the BS.
100 months at number 1, the O'Reilly Factor, Fox News Channel. Be here.
Okay, so the next clip I want to show is of the Rachel Maddow show, the flagship show of MSNBC, Fox's partisan opposite, and it's around the same time, 2010.
News is about stories. It's about finding all the disparate facts and then finding their coherence. Doing this right takes rigor and a devotion to facts that borders on obsessive.
So what's the explanation for what happened? The government was elected.
At the end of the day, though, this is about what's true in the world.
Good evening. We begin tonight with the story that no one is talking about.
So people often draw equivalences between the conservative Fox News and the liberal MSNBC due to their common use of a partisan branding strategy, really with Oberman in the starting with Oberman in the mid-2000s. However, this superficial commonality tells us little about the stark differences we see in how these two networks represent themselves and their audiences in these clips. The O'Reilly Factor promo uses populist language in scenes of confrontation to depict O'Reilly as a fighter, right, as a champion of the little guy. Dominant ratings numbers are touted to legitimate the factor as the voice of the majority. Maddow, on the other hand, is presented as a researcher, a writer, an intellectual. Her cultural authority rests on her devotion to rigorous empiricism and sound research. It's an appeal designed for an audience who especially prides themselves as being members of the fact-based community, to use Gabriel Sherman's language. So the aesthetic features of the factor promo, from the music to the sound bites to the visuals, are designed to create a sense of physicality and emotional intensity, whereas the presentational style of Maddow's ad elicits a pensive, cerebral mood. So in these ads, we see two competing consumer appeals. The first is what I term a populist appeal, and the second is culturally aspirational. And these stylistic orientations are by no means exclusive to the cable news field. They shape and direct the market addresses of print, radio, and online outlets as well. So for example, I'm going to play a clip of the New York Times, a venerable, print newspaper. So this is also in 2010.
Styles that brought us together. I think it was the Sunday style that brought us together.
I think it was the Weekend Review.
Getting the Times delivered for me, well, that's really the best part of the weekend. That's why I love the Weekender.
It's a Friday, Saturday, Sunday subscription that puts you in the center of the conversation.
The depth and breadth of reporting, the insight.
Call the 800 number and you save 50%.
Just $3.45 a week delivers the world to your home.
It's the best deal around. How many sections are you fluent in?
I'm fluent in 3 sections, actually. Business, travel, the book review.
Sunday styles.
You call the toll-free number and you save 50%.
He likes the deal.
I do.
I just went to Spain and the travel section helped me plan my trip. So you call the 800 number and you save 50%.
50% off home delivery? Fantastic.
The best journalists in the world work for the Times, and there's no debating that.
So here we see, in addition to stressing the Times' professional excellence and its commitment to objective reporting, this ad also associates the Times subscribers with the professional class social world and a cosmopolitan taste culture. So like National Public Radio, itself an outlet that bends over backwards to prove its professionalism, the Times is still predominantly viewed as liberal, and by conservatives like O'Reilly as far left, as he actually called it all the time, the far left paper, right? So this points to the problem of assuming that the partisan mapping of the American news environment is based solely on oppositional editorial biases. This conceptualization of media partisanship tends to overlook the indirect ways in which the marketing strategies of news outlets actually create political associations through social identifiers and stylistic appeals. So I see a Q&A. Okay, I can't click on it. So my book, Fox Populism, strives to get us to rethink what media partisanship is, and to question the extent to which its popular conceptualization is really about political ideology. To rely on a left-right ideological schema to define Fox News is to miss how the network manufactures Republican partisanship as an identity style. So this, I was going to talk a little bit about Trump, but I'm going to say that for the Q&A. I would just say that Trump's political rise, right, an ideologically unorthodox Republican, former reality TV star turned populist politician, really punctuates the importance of style as an analytic category. So I'll end there and just open it up.
Okay, why don't we, at this time, I'd like to go ahead and invite Dr. Campy to sort of respond.
Okay, hi everyone. Thank you so much for that presentation. I'm going to comment on some of the really important themes that I see in Professor Peck's work and give some comments related to my own work on conservative media. So I think that Professor Peck's work helps explain how the Fox News Network has successfully marketed pro-business and anti-welfare politics to a popular base. And he does so by giving a backstory of the cultural sources of Fox News and how they were brought together in a propagandistic style taken from the tabloids. I think what Fox has achieved that I think Professor Peck's work really shows is that it's tightened the link between conservative political culture and the Republican Party. And I want to point out here that this polarization of political identities itself poses a challenge for democracy. So what we see after 2 decades of Fox News leading cable news ratings is cultural identification so polarized that we can imagine folks supporting the Republican Party for issues of cultural affinity, regardless of policy positions, or even at the expense of policies that hurt their own health or economic well-being. So I'd like to emphasize that part of what we've done is link conservatism to anti-democratic norms, not just to hostility to democratic norms of egalitarianism, pluralism, or social support for all of us in our most vulnerable moments, but rather Fox News has helped tie the Republican Party and conservatism to an alternative political culture based in the love of strongman and the celebration of force, and the project of redeeming privileges of race, status, and gender for white Christian heterosexual families deemed to be the moral and true Americans. So Professor Peck asks, why did Fox News succeed where prior conservative networks failed? And I think that he really hits the nail on the head with noting how Fox News drew on popular movement culture of the right, seeded it. So in my research on conservative media, I focus on the right-wing movement culture created through conservative evangelical revival in the 70s and the 80s. And media was central to this movement. Christian broadcasting exploded in the 1970s. In 1979, Pat Robertson's 700 Club, his TV show, had 5 million average viewers, the same number of average viewers as Tucker Carlson and Hannity had on Fox News in just last month. And Christian broadcasting was tied to movement organizations of the Christian right, such as Falwell's Moral Majority in the 1990s, linked churches to Christian lifestyle multimedia networks that also engaged in mass-based political organizing around culture war issues that have come to define the terms of polarization, abortion and LGBT rights, and law and order politics that's suspicious of racial justice. So I think that if we look at the symbols and ideologies of race and gender on Fox News that Professor Peck was speaking a bit about, we see how culture war issues are central to Fox News's ideological framing of anti-welfare, anti-state politics as pro-working class. Mm-hmm. So Professor Peck shows how Fox class populism at the level of style. He shows that a political affinity, in this sense, in this case, right-wing populism, can be communicated through symbols and forms of address and not just through content. And I'd like to point out here that Fox's style is hyper-masculine. Talk shows often involve hyper-masculine scenes of dominance in which hosts address liberal guests through aggressive rants, interrupting and belittling their liberal guest commentators. The delivery matches the message. The message frames democratic norms such as concern for the marginalized, solidarity across difference, as morally weak, and it dismisses them. Fox's hyper-masculine politics of force is also raced as white, and Professor Peck spoke about this. I would just emphasize that in Fox populism, the welfare state is feminized and racialized, and social mobility is symbolically and misleadingly linked to a masculine and militarized politics of force. So I think that this tie of political style with the idealization of the white family in this propagandistic tone I would agree with Professor Peck, is a much more salient political identity that makes it harder to roll back than a purely ideological political commitment. That's all I have.
Great, thanks, Dr. Campy.
Yeah, it was great.
Okay, so let's see, Dr. Finlay.
There we go. Can you guys hear me okay?
Yes.
Oh, great. So yes, I just wanted to first of all thank Reese and Ashley both. I think you guys have really unpacked quite a bit about Fox, and I just wanted to add sort of three main points. One of them is I do think that we can see sort of the American tradition at play here in terms of the 1970s and that Ashley was just speaking about. But I also think it's important to recognize the sort of the British style that Fox is playing with, right? It's a marriage between Roger Ailes, Nixon, Jerry Falwell, and Rupert Murdoch. And this is tabloid style journalism in the print form from Great Britain, which has a really long, quite frankly, anti-democratic history that plays on the insecurities of people that have been marginalized by the class system in Great Britain in a way that's quite different than has happened in the United States. And right through to the sexualization of women, you know, on page 3 girls in UK tabloids, through to how Fox News has done that with their hosts over the years. And so I wanted to sort of enlarge the conversation a bit to think about how this is both a story that is uniquely American, but also a story of British cultural imperialism in a way that I think is important to think about, because part of why I think we've seen those that are upset by Fox News have trouble with truly understanding what's going on with particularly the aesthetics that Reese was speaking about, is that they're trying to apply an American construction of politics to it. And that really is only part of the story. What we're seeing is a bleed over into more of a British style class politics, right? That really speaks to victimization, insecurity, and reification of class statuses, right? I mean, Fox News doesn't really try and suggest, as Reese pointed out, that you are to try and aspire to something better. It's more that it speaks directly to your insecurity and says you don't need to be insecure. You can have the fist fight that, you know, Hannity would have wanted to have on most nights, as opposed to the careful conversations behind the glasses that Maddow wears, right? So that would be point one. I want to suggest that Fox News is perhaps, even though the ratings would tell us that it's at its height of its powers, that it's completely destroying the other networks most nights, the other cable news networks, I should say, most nights, that in fact it's actually tethered to an older legacy media broadcasting system, and the economics of it don't really speak very well to a long future for Fox News, at least at the pinnacle of success that it has right now. What it's basically doing is it's losing demographics every few years as that demographic dies off, and it's not replacing them fully. And that's partially a construct of the political economic forces at play, which make it's cable news, right? And most of the folks probably in attendance right now, certainly the students, don't regularly watch cable news. That is something that we can understand more as associated with an older generation, and also a difference in terms of class, right? Again, you know, people watch Fox News or cable news more generally because they don't have easy access to other news sources that are more expensive, whether that be something like the New York Times or just simply, you know, fiber or cable internet connections. So in the long run, I'm curious to hear what other panelists think about this. I think that the sort of political economic forces may actually end up sort of as a noose for that organization unless they imagine themselves in an internet space. And they haven't done that yet, which means that they haven't really grown their audience. And in fact, their audience is shrinking, which one could argue is why they have become that much more populist, that much more extreme in their propagandist approach. On that point, what I've been intrigued by is the counter-conservative movement to Fox News over the last 5 years, which is the rise of Sinclair Broadcast. Because Sinclair Broadcast uses a completely different mechanism, which is less overtly populist, less overtly engaged with the aesthetics that Reese's book is about, and yet it reaches more homes at this point because it connects to viewers through broadcast, right? And in a way, I can see that not quite as a return to Buckley, but certainly a different approach that seems to be speaking to either that middle-class conservative that Trump has lost, or is trying to just rebrand the entire conservative movement, recognizing that there's a certain dead end that they are facing demographically and in terms of just the collapse of cable over the next 5 to 10 years. And I'm intrigued by it both because it's switched its modality in terms of the medium that it uses, but also, quite frankly, the aesthetics of Sinclair product are completely different, and in some ways a little bit more frightening because they're a little bit more invisible in terms of their propagandist elements. So I wanted to throw that out to everybody to sort of ask about how they see Sinclair fitting into this story. Those are the three big points I wanted to bring up, which was sort of the class piece, the sort of demographic noose that is around Fox, and then the Sinclair alternative.
Great, thanks a lot. Dr. Fox. Dr. Fox would like to comment.
Okay, there, I'm sorry, I was saying something that had to unmute me.
How you doing?
So thank you, Reese and Professor Peck. I thought that was great. I think a lot of people who comment and talk about Fox News in a simplistic way don't actually watch it. So I really am appreciative of people who actually watch it. I've watched hours and hours of Fox News, not as much as you, clearly not as much as you based on your study. I'll be very brief. So I'm a traditional political scientist who studies US politics, the social sciences, a lot of counting of voters' attitudes, or the fundamental question I've always looked at is why do people run for office? So I'm often engaged with what people think of the political system they're watching. And when I sort of grew up studying political science in the 90s, it was dominated by rational choice theory. That most people in politics have a clear goal. Poor voters will vote for the party that's going to sort of offer them more benefits. Working class people will vote for the party that wants to sort of provide better wages and sort of safer working conditions. Rich people will vote for the party for tax cuts. And your work and sort of the recent time show that's all just not true anymore, right? The cultural identity of sort of your side has become so much more important. And I would just sort of throw out, you sort of talked about sensationalism and sort of the way kind of the news and cultural populism are blending with ideology. I thought sort of also the way guns, religion, and anti-intellectualism have become part of that identity too. Like, oh, you're from the New York Times. Oh, your colleges are now disdained, universities, places of higher learning, because that's not part of that identity, and sort of how that might play in with what was going on earlier. I've also read a lot of analysis, and I wonder what you would think about this, about how sort of the corporate class of Republicans or conservatives, the old Bill Buckley mainline conservatives who sort of want less government, lower taxes, are really using this cultural identity to get what they want by manipulating a large group of voters with identification. So I don't know if you sort of came across any ways to think that was true. Is that what Roger Ailes was up to, in some ways, sort of serving kind of corporate masters? And lastly, I would just say to Chris's point, I'm pretty despairing about the information environment at this point. Maybe Fox News is declining in its reach, but it has created this identity. And our polarization, our system is so in depth and so bad. If you speak to somebody who's of an opposing political viewpoint of yours, it's become hard to even have a conversation. And when you watch focus groups of liberals or conservatives that are being done all across this election, they're living in different realities. And I think part of it is this cultural identity, or a large part of it is this cultural identity that was begun sort of in the modern era with Fox News. So I would just leave it at that.
Thank you, Dr. Fox. Dr. Jarvis.
Yeah, I would just add a couple of things. First is, to touch on something that's been raised both by Reese and by Chris, I think that the Fox model itself was incredibly successful, and that sort of history, the transnational history of the success of that model is really important. If anything, it sort of speaks to the fact that they've been able to go from Australia with an organization, because they're sort of a unique media organization in the sense that they always were news. News Corp was always news. It never branched out into other areas, and that's somewhat unique among major, large, multinational news organizations. And so what they did in Australia worked really well. Murdoch goes to the United Kingdom and does basically the same thing with tabloid media, and Chris talked about the British form. And I think that speaks to what happened there. And so the time they got to the US, there was a model that was already predicted or already successful. Human interest stories, a lot of focus on crime, and then highly conservative politics. And so that across their history, you can see that play out. And so I think it's important to sort of identify that. And it's interesting to me that that's been very successful in places that were part of the British Empire for a little while. So that identity that people have been speaking about has a sort of transnational life to it. The second thing I would highlight, and I think that Professor Fox just talked about this a little bit, is that the social media environment has amplified the way this identity works. If you look at Facebook, the most popular engagements are things that are like Ben Shapiro, the Daily Caller. The engagements are all very high on extremely partisan media sources that go even far beyond the identity that Fox has created to a sort of more extreme level. And I think that this sort of builds on that identity that Dr. Peck was talking about. I also think that Twitter makes this a little bit worse as well, because a lot of people are very siloed, and the form, to speak to the stylistic issues that Dr. Peck is raising, the form of Twitter lends itself to this, because Twitter is functionally all enthymemes. To think about rhetorical form for a second, it's all incomplete arguments that require you to fill in the blank to a certain extent, or have basic knowledge, or you can't really even engage it. The word limit itself lends itself to that. So we end up with not just siloed arguments, but arguments that are incomplete, that are asking the audience to engage in a very unique way. And I think that that's one of the things that Trump has done, is take those ideas very effectively and use them in that particular format.
Great, thank you, Dr. Jarvis. I want to give a little bit of time of just to sort of maybe move organically into Reese. Did you want to add?
I mean, there's so many juicy. I mean, they've often there's so many good points and so many good questions, and I'll do my best to get. I want to respond to all of them because they're all really good. So, I mean, I want to start with Dr. Campy's point about the authoritarian and kind of the pleasure in imagining kind of dominance and vindicating, deviant groups, right, that Fox News presents as villains. And often it is, supposedly minorities with lacking work ethic or not following, law and order. This has been a bigger theme, but it was there with Nixon, right? He did the big law and order campaign after the riots in '68, and Trump is trying to do a 2.0 version of that. But I would say there's one exception to Fox's authoritarian kind of emphasis, and it's that it presents itself as culturally egalitarian, right? So it tries to shatter the hierarchy of high and low. And what's nefarious about it is it tries to paint being anti-racist as elitist, right? So when you point out these gender inequalities that Dr. Campy brought up, right, that Fox News is playing on, they position pointing that out as being elitist, right? Because you're, in various ways, through various techniques. So in some ways they use a kind of cultural egalitarian politics that's conveyed implicitly through the aesthetics they pick, right? And through the anchoring styles they pick, and then use that egalitarian kind of aesthetic to advance authoritarian and anti-egalitarian politics along the axes of gender and class and race. So I would just add that it's the way they entangle contradictory kind of discourses, right? Which, if we look at hegemony theory, that's part of the way that Gramsci talks about the way hegemony works, is that there's always these appeals, symbolic appeals to the lower classes in order to advance reactionary ideas, right? And so so that was one point that made me think of it, but I agree 100% with the point about hypermasculinity and whiteness, and that's very much communicated through the style, not just through the ideological content. The point that Dr. Finlay brought up, so I actually make this point that ironically Fox News is in many ways a foreign import. And so I talk about the importance that Rupert Murdoch was trained on Fleet Street. So in my first chapter, I start the first chapter with young Murdoch at Oxford, right, working as an intern at one of the London tabloids, right, under Lord Beaverbrook, right, who was this tabloid editor in London. And he learned that the market, that in the UK model, it was much more explicitly about class markets. They were much more attuned to the class divisions. And actually Murdoch complained when the New York Post, right, his first attempt at creating a real British style tabloid in America, right, he complained that New Yorkers weren't liking it because they their tastes were above their own station, as he said. They have a self-improvement ethic. That, in other words, they don't own their own working class tastes, right? They want to be better than that. Everyone's trying to get ahead in America, right? But what he came to realize is the limitations of the newsstand, that it may work in Australia and in UK, that these tabloids are the ones driving the news cycle and they're the ones electing politicians. But in America, TV is king. So this is why he needed to launch Fox Broadcasting as a stepping stone. And it's telling that his real true entry into the American media market was non-news, even though Jarvis was right in saying that News Corp did start as a purely news corporation, but really the biggest profits that News Corporation started to garner was through Fox Broadcasting, its television venture. It started to immediately eclipse all of its other assets globally, right? That it was The Simpsons, it was Married with Children, it was all this anti-elitist counter programming to the Cosby Show and to the kind of more genteel programming of the networks, right? So, but and then he plays with The Current Affair with Maury Povich, and then that is an adaptation. Literally, A Current Affair is named after an Australian show called The Current Affair. Like, he took the exact name. And, Cops and America's Most Wanted, these were reality genres that were copied off of German and British shows that came before Fox Broadcasting. So it's very, very important what both Dr. Finley and Dr. Jarvis point out, is that there is this important transnational story to Fox News. It really did import media styles and formats and politics. The other point about the London, News of the World and why am I missing the other one? The other major, The Sun, right? With the Page 3 girls, it's so important that Dr. Finley brought that up, or Chris brought that up, because, literally the Page 3 girls turned that paper almost overnight into the dominant newspaper in London because of that use of sexual vulgarity and the misogyny. And this overlaps with like the Benny Hill show, the type of humor that was going on in the UK at the time, which we see in Married with Children. So Married with Children is very much an analog to the Benny Hill show, or similar, right? And so just one really good point. The point about Fox's audience dying because of demographics, I'm not so sure. I mean, there's been a long time where people say that they're going to go eventually, right? I mean, 10 years ago, they were saying its audience is so old. How are they going to survive? And yet there is some signs that they themselves, their executives, are afraid of this issue that Chris brought up. They launched Fox Nation, right? Which is a streaming app that stars Tommy Lauren as a way to get in on that streaming market where the cord cutting, younger people are not buying full cable services anymore, right? And so they're trying to and they're recruiting right-wing YouTube stars and podcasters, but on the other hand, this baby boomer demographic is very profitable no matter how old they are. If you look at TV commercials, they're all geared, even in network television, they're all geared at Viagra and pharmaceutical, they're geared toward this older audience. So, and also another point about that is talking about political influence is sometimes we underestimate the political impact of grandparents, right? In shaping the political dispositions of parents and grandchildren, right? So, I mean, I grew up in Utah and my grandparents were what they believed and what they thought was a big deal. Right. So in some ways, the fact that they have grandma and grandpa is nothing to blink an eye at in terms of political socialization, right, and political influence. The last part.
Can I just interject real quick, because I think this is kind of there is a question here that sort of is even all of this is sort of like, I wanted to interject because it's all kind of sort of, you know, focusing around this question, and it's one of the questions that's being, it's a long question, so I won't read the whole thing, but generally what it's talking about is this you know, the effectiveness of conceiving and presenting free market values in racial terms is somewhat surprising because how it results in so many poor rural whites supporting billionaire-friendly policies, right? And then sort of in the end, it says, is Trump's ascent the function of Fox's ability to awkwardly square the circle of aligning poor whites with billionaires, or is it something else happening? And I think maybe you're sort of talking about this, but maybe, you know, if you could direct it kind of around that question.
Well, the way I'd respond to that is to go back to the way you introduced me, is this question of how the right changed how we think about class, and how Fox News, by extension, when they captured the kind of populist rhetoric with George Wallace, even McCarthy before that, and then Nixon kind of fine-tuned it, that they turned class, they redefined class as a cultural identity as opposed to an economic position, right? And so this kind of informal theory of class as a cultural identity, that's the secret to how you can make sense of how someone like Donald Trump, a millionaire real estate mogul, right, who grew up with a silver spoon in his mouth, could present himself as a champion of the working class, right? So Trump, you know, you can say, you can point to his biography, but he is a creature of the tabloid media. He's been learning and training on how to speak through taste and culture, the language of class, first through the New York tabloid scene in the 80s, second with the reality television show throughout the 2000s, and then also with World Wrestling Entertainment. He's a full-blown fictional character in that universe, and has been for a long time.
Dr. Finlay, did you want to jump in there?
So yeah, that's how I would explain that gap, right? Is that he appeals to them through a kind of cultural understanding of class, less about an economic.
Sorry, Reese, for cutting you off.
No worries.
Actually, Reese, I just want to jump on what you were just saying, because I think that's such an important point to underline, because I think that, and this is why that transnational lens I think matters so much, is that idea of changing it from an economic status to a cultural status is something that I think it's very difficult to actually come to terms with. And I was looking at the draft of Sean Terry's question, where he said, you know, how does he square this circle? Is it something else? And I think what you were suggesting there is so important, which is to recognize that if we understand whether it's Australia or Britain, in other words, the British Empire at some level is what I'm talking about here. It doesn't matter how much money you make in your life. If you're born in one class, you stay in that class regardless, right? It is a cultural position. There is no ascent. There is no American dream in Britain, right? Where you can jump class positions. Literally your accent will define you. And those taste cultures will define you. And that's the importation that I think is so important, is that style is something that is not alien to the United States, but certainly has been downplayed in the United States, with the emphasis on meritocracy. Whether we believe in meritocracy in the United States or not is a different question, but certainly our sort of aspirational elements of the American creed do not really take that into account very well. And what we've seen is a wholesale embrace of this more European class-centric style. And so, Reese, I know you said that. I just wanted to just really underline that point, because I think it's so important.
But I would say there had to be material conditions on the ground for that British understanding of class to make sense. And the conditions I point to in my book is really the explosion of higher education and the rise of kind of a split in the broad middle class of America between the college educated and the non-college educated. And this bears out in election results. It bears out when you compare the audience of Fox News and conservative media compared to liberal media. So there is some form of material basis to it when you think about educational credentials and the socialization experience that happens when you go to college, right? And the kind of posture it creates. And if you don't go to college, also that alternative. And so I think that, in the shift of the service economy to the information economy, we're having a college credential becomes more important in the labor market, people like George Wallace really exploited that taste and educational divide that was just starting to form. And then the conservative media has ran with it, right? And constructed like that divide as a conservative versus liberal divide, when it's not inherently at all like has to be that read in those partisan terms, but they've constructed it as such, right? They've linked, and so I think that would be the only thing I would add to that I 100% agree with you. And that's very interesting that it's a British formulation, but there's something that had to happen in the American economy on the ground that would allow that to resonate, right, in some way.
And it serves the economic interest as well of those that have more money, because you're also no longer pushing this idea of aspiration or education. It's like, you stay in your place, right? And be proud of that place. You know, be angry from that victim status, but don't ever do anything with it. It's sort of the what's the matter with Kansas argument to a certain extent, right? I was curious, just really quickly, to the other panelists, you know, Jason, you had brought up Ben Shapiro earlier, sort of as this sort of example of how extraordinarily well he does, for instance, through Facebook and his various other digital platforms. He definitely doesn't style himself as a Fox person, though, right? He's a pseudo-intellectual, right? And it's like the conservative college kids love Ben Shapiro. They don't really like, you know, Judge Jeanine, right? And so I'm interested in how we can understand the conservative mediascape as it relates to that class distinction between, let's say, Shapiro or Sinclair Broadcasting, and then Fox and the Rush Limbaugh show, because they're two very different camps of conservatism.
Could I just ask you to clarify? So is the assumption that like Fox News has a more lower class constituency versus Ben Shapiro, who has a more educated constituency? Because I guess I would tend to
Chris, right? Or
there we go. It's not in terms of its constituency so much in terms of how it styles, how it's constructing its own audience and how it's speaking to its audience, right? So Shapiro certainly speaks to the audience as sort of the Rachel Maddow of the conservative side. Now, whether or not it's the demographics play that out, that's the way that it's addressing the audience. Whereas Fox News is quite proud of not trying to do that.
Yeah, the facts over feelings, like O'Reilly and Limbaugh are more like I'm angry, you know, I'm about my. Is that what you mean? Like it's not.
Yeah,
like,
and it's like, more like. Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah, I mean it is weird. The alt-right has this whole pseudo-intellectual thing that has surprised me, but kind of makes sense when you're thinking about a younger demographic who's coming of age and trying to, you know, engage in politics. I find this in my students, right? They are really committed to the high modern journalism style. So like I try to get them to critique it or see the shortcomings of this kind of professional detached mode of address. And they don't want to do it. They all are like that. We need to come back to the facts and reason. They're very committed to whether they're on the left or the right. It's really interesting to kind of get them to critique the Walter Cronkite moment. Right. And they just wish we could return to it. So I think you're onto something there, that Shapiro and what's his name? The other conservative intellectual that Jordan Peterson, right? That like these are their gods. And I don't know. I think of it as an age thing, but I could be wrong.
I would support that. I think that one of the things that has been mentioned is that education was a historical flashpoint. George Wallace stood on the steps of a school and tried to prevent it from being integrated. And at that point, schools started to become something there's a historical touchstone there when it comes to education that makes it much easier to critique them once they're no longer fully white spaces, quite frankly. So I think that is maybe not something that we were thinking about originally, but if we're going to look at the history of where education starts to become a little less popular for conservatism, I would say that's potentially an important moment. And may speak to why there's a difference between what you see on Fox, which largely tends to gear itself towards an older audience, and somebody like Ben Shapiro, who is social media savvy in a way that a lot of the Fox people certainly have not been so far.
I would say I'm not sure it matters, actually, because of the way algorithms and everybody's bubble is constructed. I think the Fox News watcher, to the degree they might get a Ben Shapiro link, are happy to hear that conservative argument because they've been sold on those conservative arguments anyway, right? So I just think when you're talking about the insulation of sort of, information silos, that those things can coexist all right. You can be angry and, oh, here's this guy, he's got a slightly more rigorous take on it. And it's all fine with you if you're in your bubble.
Yeah, I mean, I have my points about Facebook to go back to Jason's last point, but I was curious about Ashley. What was did you see something different in the constituencies between Rush Limbaugh?
No, I was just going to point out that I think that there are certainly differences in the sort of class-styled address of Ben Shapiro and Fox News. There's a very similar affect of what I would call authoritarianism and sort of the vitriolic way, the vitriolic tone with which those who they disagree with are addressed, with hatred and sort of the style of argumentation through sort of not any spirit of sort of compromise and giving reasons and thinking through the opposition's reasons, but rather sort of very aggressively stating one's own case in a way that sort of shuts down any opposition and casts any disagreement as weakness on the part of the other side. I think that those stylistic elements resonate between these different conservative voices.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with that. I mean, that's one thing that I kind of ended my book with. What about Tucker and Ben Shapiro, both LA, La Jolla, extremely elite families on the West Coast. I was like, how is this going to work? Because Bill O'Reilly and Hannity are Long Island guys. They have that white, ethnic, Catholic, Irish, blue collar, disposition. And this one thing I tell people is that, we find out how disgusting Bill O'Reilly was as a person, but let's just talk about how he was as a performer. That in his performance, I think most people only saw Bill O'Reilly from The Daily Show or from YouTube clips, right? And him losing it. So you only saw this angry register. But if you actually watch the shows in full, you find out that he can be human and self-deprecating and charming. And I don't see that with Ben, you know what I mean? I don't see that vulnerability. So one of the things that Ailes actually coached, he said a master communicator is one that can communicate vulnerability, right? And so he would coach, that's why he recruited people from these non-prestige sectors of the news environment. But I don't see that vulnerability at all I don't see that appeal there with Shapiro. It's pure kind of I'm right, authoritarian, like what you're talking about. And there's also no appeal to working class identity. It's not trying to entangle these reactionary elements with maybe an underdog kind of story. It's all like, I'm right, I'm on the side of the facts, right? And so, yeah, I don't know how, I'm always puzzled on how these characters like Tucker and Ben Shapiro have been so popular. But I think going back to Jason's point, I think there's some element of it is it's like a coming of age thing for young white men, right? They want to be like Tucker, to go into a university classroom and own the liberals with reason and rationality. And it is I think there's something about the age of that audience. And I don't know if they grow older, if they will, like other types of, I grew up to country music and I rejected it as a young man. I liked hip hop, and then I get older and I start to appreciate country music more. So I don't know. I mean, I don't know with that style what's going on. But on the Facebook point that Jason brought up is that, so there's an interesting Vox piece that just came out today, and the arguments by Brian Feldman, and I participated as some other conservative media scholars participated in the interview, and what he tries to argue, which I find compelling, is he says Facebook didn't create the polarization. It was actually the conservative media that came before it that already suited the values and incentive system of the algorithms in Facebook. So like Facebook is a right-wing media system unintentionally or unwittingly, because it rewards, what does it reward? Emotional outbursts, sensation. Clickbait is not that different from the tabloid headline. The Maury Povich and Jerry Springer, someone throwing a chair, is not that different than the viral video.
I think
right?
it's really important to talk about Fox News as propaganda on this point.
Yeah, what was that?
I think it's important personally to talk about the propagandistic aspects of Fox News. I mean, I think you won't agree with me since you are interested in critiquing sort of mainstream journalistic norms as well. But I think that the line that can and should be drawn, and I think that the reticence to draw that line is sort of what makes it more difficult to yeah, I guess critique the danger of Fox News, which is not something I'm attributing to you necessarily, but
yeah, I mean, I think like, does Fox News operate as almost like the arm of the Republican Party? Yeah, it does operate like that, and we would call that propaganda. I guess what we have to grapple with, right, is the idea that if you call it propaganda when 1/4 of the country considers it like the news, right, that Bill O'Reilly was considered more of a prominent journalist than Walter Cronkite, it gets difficult because that term, journalism, is an unstable category right now. And so, like, I hear you, like, you're like, if it looks like a duck, quacks like a duck, that's propaganda. But I think that we're in a media environment that is so hyper partisan and polarized that I don't know if, like, I don't know if you can define it away, by calling it propaganda. I guess I'm not disagreeing with you, like, in its function, its political function, right? But I don't know. Yeah, I don't know. I'm myself am like conflicted about it. I don't know what to do.
Dr. Jarvis, did you want to jump in there?
I guess I would just be a little more nuanced. Like, I would agree with Ashley if you're talking about Hannity or Tucker Carlson, but I don't think that's a fair assessment of Chris Wallace, for example. I just think that the voices who are actual journalists get massively swamped by all of the opinion people who are pretending to be journalists. And I don't know what you do with that, because the ratings are so good for Hannity and all those other people that it's almost like the hard news is an afterthought in relation to all the opinion and spin that's being, which I think maybe functionally is propaganda in a lot of cases, and in some cases perhaps worse, given that some of the
what's worse than propaganda, right?
I mean, abject racism and some of the things that pass for spin, I think, go beyond propaganda and encouraging violence. I mean, I've certainly seen things that I would think are not just Trump spin on the news. They're just awful things to say about humans. But
if you watch Fox over its 25-year history, it starts, like you said, Professor, with O.J. Simpson was their first big story, or one of them in 1995 when they pop on the news. It's gotten way where the last 4 years, it's whether there's a semi-propaganda to complete propaganda in the primetime hours where the hosts are, the popular hosts are, it's completely Republican/Trump TV at this point in the primetime hours. So, and defending it's so pure, it seems to me somewhere akin to pure propaganda at that point.
Yeah, and you could say that Chris Wallace and Brett Hume and the prestige kind of wing of the network represents, it functions more as like a PR device, as an alibi, right, for the primetime shows that are its bread and butter, that define its brand and that garner the most ratings. But I agree with you, in the organization there is some tensions of style and in terms of news practices, but the main thing that defines Fox News is Sean Hannity, right? Is Bill O'Reilly. That is its brand. That's what distinguished it. Because before that, you could do news from a conservative point of view, right? And that was what Newt Gingrich and Paul Wainwright tried. That was, I mean, I would say network news was actually, for depending on how you look at it ideologically. But that's something I think Hannity showing up at a Trump rally, literally, and then in my work I talk about them broadcasting live from Tea Party protests, right? So it's like a full-blown Glenn Beck, Sean Hannity, I forgot the other anchor, but they were mobilizing the rank and file of the Tea Party movement and telling them the locations. It was serving literally an organizational function, right, for a political movement. And so, yeah, I mean, I think the lines between activism and journalism have been thoroughly blurred. And that's, yeah, I don't know what to do about that.
I think that's an interesting point to sort of wrap up and think about this, which I think is one of the important things that comes out of this, is this moment of activism and journalism has always been there, but it seems to be very much salient today, especially during our time period, which is why I'm glad that we could have this discussion right before, you know, whatever happens in the next few days. So I want to thank every one of you for being part of this panel. I think it was a really good discussion. I hope that perhaps we could do this again with more time. And because, you know, these are, as we've talked about, historical problems that have long reach in our political culture. So, but I want to again extend my thanks to each one of you. I appreciate you coming. I appreciate the discussion. I think it was informative. And I want to bid you all good night.
Thank you. This was great.
Thank
you for inviting me.